Hello, everyone. My name is Benjamin Sear, and I'm currently working at Sandia National Labs, involved in some of the hardware security research going on there. But I've been asked today to present some of my PhD research that I did at the University of Michigan, working with Kevin Fu, who will be at the panel after this, working on, and some other collaborators on looking at some interesting vulnerabilities within some sensors. The main thing I want to get about this talk is that sometimes when we develop systems in computation, we tend to think of, we tend to abstract, right? We take things outside of the hardware, the real world that it actually exists in order to simplify and make it easier to work with things. But sometimes that abstraction sort of takes too many leaps and leads towards a gap that can be exploited within a cyber attack. So I'm going to actually start out with a video. It's just a demo of what we've done.
Okay, opening.
So from the video, you saw that in our research, we actually used a laser mounted in a different building, actually the clock tower of the university, firing through a window to affect a smart home device on the other side that was within a home in such a state. And so these smart home devices, you've probably seen somewhere, they're designed to listen to voice commands from a user in order to complete certain actions. And there's already immediately some concerns as far as how do you authenticate in a user-friendly way for some of these devices in order to be able to perform privileged actions. But we showed that using as you can see, we can actually use a laser to actually activate these devices. And we called this attack like commands. So first, I just want to introduce some of the microelectronics that are involved and the MEMS microphones that actually capture the acoustic sound whenever you are communicating with these devices. And this is actually a mesh of a microelectronic ASIC, but also a microelectronic mechanical system, a MEMS device. And both are packaged in the same package where you have the MEMS device is a diaphragm, almost like a drum head that reacts towards incoming acoustic energy, vibrating. And this is connected towards a microelectronic ASIC that takes that vibrating motion and transforms it into an electrical signal, a voltage signal that can be used by the by the system. The system itself only sees that electrical voltage, and due to the abstraction, we sort of expect that the voltage signal that we see is the acoustic signal that is coming in. But in some of our research and our experiments, we were surprised to find that if we modulated a laser into the acoustic port of a microphone, the output voltage follows that modulation almost exactly. And this was a bit unexpected. And if you change, so by modulation, I mean changing the brightness. So as you change the brightness from brighter to dimmer, that gets correlated towards the output. And if you can think about it, if you can put an audio signal on that modulation, suddenly the voltage signal out of the microphone, from the system's perspective, looks like someone is saying something or saying a voice. And yeah. So why does this happen? When we first discovered this, it was sort of a situation where we wanted to see what would happen, and it was a lot easier than we thought. But it was very unclear as to why exactly it was happening. And it took a lot of different sets of experiments to narrow down and figure out physically what is going on. And it turns out that it's a combination of multiple different effects, the two main ones being shown here. One is photoelectric effects. So this is something that every single semiconductor will be vulnerable to some extent. in that light will generate charge carriers within the ASIC device and generate electric signals. So by shining certain lasers through the diaphragm, traveling through the diaphragm, bouncing around in the package and hitting the ASIC, you could generate an analog signal directly with the photoelectric effects. On top of that, you had this branch of physics called photoacoustics, where light generates different thermal and other effects on the membrane and diaphragm itself as you're hitting it, which can cause it to move on its own. So that includes the primary mechanism, which is a thermal piston is what it's called, where you're heating up the gas within the package, and that's pushing outwards in an acoustic wave against the diaphragm. And we did this against many different microphones. Every single microphone that we tested had at least some level of vulnerability towards it. We were able to use blue lasers, green lasers, red lasers, and you can see in some of the plots how the different colors as you're traveling through the diaphragm or attacking different amounts of those different effects, you actually see different signals within the frequency spectrum of this laser signal injection. And on top of that, we also showed that this also occurs in infrared, so you can imagine you have an invisible laser that could actually activate these devices as well. So again, I wanted to highlight this is a vulnerability that maybe not necessarily is that hard to defend against. Like you can use different detection methods if you understand that it exists to be able to register that, hey, there's light entering the package. You can detect that that's happening, and suddenly you can no longer trust your microphone. Shielding in general, how do you reduce light energy from hitting vulnerable components? And you can do that. One, all the microphones that we looked at had different epoxies that were covering the ASIC, but not enough because you could always get some light around the epoxy. But better techniques of applying that epoxy would help prevent some of those photoelectric effects. Or anytime you can block line of sight to the diaphragm itself, you are reducing the amount of energy that is transferred to the diaphragm and reducing your photoacoustic signal. But all of this occurs because of a gap between how the system designers saw a microphone, something that just captures acoustic energy, transforms it into a voltage, and I read that voltage. But in essence, we live in a real world with real physics, and different effects generate this acoustic signal in a way that wasn't thought about or intended, and that led to this vulnerability. So I just want to sort of extend this to talk about this gap, this misunderstanding between what we expect a system to do, what we expect microelectronics to do, what we expect a sensor to give us, and what is actually real, what physics exists, and how things actually work. We rely on models and abstractions in order to make life simpler, in order to make it easier to interface with things, but there always has to be some level of understanding as far as what are we really doing? What is the reality of the situation? And this vulnerability, extends towards many other devices, even within the laser realm. We showed that the same thing affects conventional microphones. We have some work looking at ASIC devices on using different analog laser signals in order to be able to extract out certain keys, and even attack other MEMS sensors, such as a piezo-resistive pressure sensor. And so I just want to leave this idea that how do we ensure that the future systems that we're excited about and want to continue to building, how do we ensure that they are secure against some of these vulnerabilities, these attacks on the gaps between what actually exists and how we expect to use them. So thank you very much for your time.